A warm welcome to one and all. In the last previous part of the session, we have dealt with respect to the another kind of the material used for the construction, especially brick. And we have also come across how the bricks have been manufactured and what are the stages of the different manufacturing process and how they have been classified. And in today's class, I am going to introduce you and take you to the new part of the topic, which is used as a unique or what we call it as a universal sort of the material since from the ancient times. That is nothing but the timber. There is a misconception between the timber as well as the wood. What is meant by wood? Wood means the outer portion of the tree when it is being cut off, that we call it as an wood itself only during the growth as well as during the death period also. Whereas timber means whatever the wood which has to be utilized for the construction purpose should possess some of the structural properties like a load bearing, strength, durability, toughness and resistance towards the fire, all these things. These criteria has been led to the usage of the name which we call it as a timber. Now, how the timber have been extracted in an olden or what we call it as an ancient times, if you take more than 3000 years ago, it has been utilized. There are different sorts of the trees where the woods are generated and finally they have been processed for the timber. But here let us go for classifying how the trees are being dealt with respect to the usage in the construction, whether basis of the growth of the wood in an outer surface or inner surface. That is a major sort of the classification. Hence, we go for naming the classification as an endogenous as well as exogenous type of the trees. What are the exogenous or endogenous? Let us get to know. Endogenous and exogenous. Endo, the term here, it represents the inner. Genus means it is the type of the species or the plant, the kingdom classification which they have done in the taxonomical part of the classification, where the generation of the trees are being taken into the picture. Whereas if you take in the case of an exo means the outer. These exogenous trees are mainly utilized. They have been broadly classified again into two types. One we call it as a coniferous and deciduous type of the trees. Let me take on the classification to the next part here. The exogenous is classified into conifers and deciduous trees, coniferous or conifers, deciduous type of the trees. The conifer type of the trees means the leaves are a flattened and scaly type of an appearance having a needle shaped type of an edges. They have the tapered type of an edges. That kind of the trees are what we call it as coniferous type of the trees. They are cone shaped bearing type of the fruits which we go for physically classifying them, cone shaped bearing fruits. These are called as the coniferous, and this cone shaped type of the fruits where the trees are being built, that is grown across, or it is subjected for the plantation and set for attaining the maturity. In their part, it is going to yield the type of the wood we call it as a sapwood. a sapwood. What is meant by a sapwood? Whenever the tree has to grow, starting from the seed, then the plant arises, whatever the vascular bundles which are being present, they tend to decay in the earlier stages, or what we come across is they tends to die. What happens? The death portion or the fibrous membranes, they are being compactly arranged without any intercellular spaces, leading to the formation of a region, what we call it as a pith. A pith is a region. Here you can able to see in the case of an exogenous type of the trees. I'll going to explain this in the later part. Now deciduous, obviously they are broad leaf type of the trees. Example here, a teak, oak. For this it is a pine, chir and fir. These are the examples for the coniferous type of the trees. Teak, oak, they are the broadened type of the leaves. They have been utilized because of the broadened shape in appearances. These kind of the trees almost have the heartwood. Heartwood. Let me explain when I go for taking up the section of an exogenous tree. If you understand these basic concepts, then it has been easy to identify. I'll also going to give you one task. Task is to identify different types of the endogenous as well as the exogenous tree, and finally you go for selecting which are the types of the woods utilized for either for furniture making, even for the load bearing purpose, even for any sorts of construction purpose, or any aesthetic or architectural or even the decorative purpose that you have to identify. This is the one of the tasks which I am going to give you. Now moving on to the next part, here endogenous, as I have told, inner medium. Example, it is a bamboo tree. Bamboo tree is a fine example or the classic example which I am going to suggest for this. Why? What is the reason? Because if you are going to take in the Malnad regions or any all over the Karnataka regions, this bamboo tree are growing to the greater extent. They are being carved out easily. They are hollow in nature. Therefore, this wood are utilized for various different purposes which are cheaply available. Most of the wood which are being available in a cheap manner, it is the sapwood. It is lighter in nature. Hardwood means slightly heavier in nature, and this proves to be slightly costlier compared to that of a sapwood. Now let us take upon for the classification part which we have completed, but the pending part is how to know whether the tree is endogenous or exogenous in nature. If you take this part of an example, the cross section of an exogenous tree, starting from the inner, where I have told that the vascular bundles which are being completely arranged, they are compactly arranged without any intercellular spaces. Upon their death, they become a dry mass completely over a period of the time. The central region, we call it as a pith. After this, there are ring formation of the structures which has been drawn here. Okay, the occurrence of these rings, we call it as an annular rings, or what we call it as a growth rings. Each rings are being getting added up year by year. So how many number of the rings are there? They have been counted. On that basis, the age of the trees are determined. This is the basis for the consideration of the formation of the growth ring, especially we also call it as an annular rings. Next, the region which is being completely surrounded here, where the rays you can able to see, we call it as the medullary rays, which are originating from the inner portion, which this portion we call it as a cambium layer. That means the region between the pith or the sapwood region between that is the sapwood region itself only, consisting of the medullary rays which have been originating and the inner bark. That particular region or the layer which has been formed, we call it as a cambium layer. Pith we have completed, cambium layer we have completed, growth rings we have completed, and the inner bark. The inner bark, if it has been developed into the gradual manner, so therefore numerous part of the growth takes place, and that we are going to call it as the outer bark. This is one of the indeed characteristics of the exogenous trees, where the bark growth takes place. Now, the wood which has been originating apart from the center of the region, we call it as a sapwood. They are lighter in nature due to the ascent of the sap. They are being still having the activities which we call it as an ascent of a sap, where the water through the vascular tissues, it is being transported through the larger or the much more height region. Due to the osmotic pressure, it has been traveling up. That's why this part of the wood is slightly wet in nature, we call it as a sapwood. The one which is being completely heavier in nature, compactly arranged, that we call it as a heartwood. Okay? The central region portion which we come across for this covering, we call it as a heartwood. Remaining portion beyond the heartwood, we call it as a sapwood. This is the classification especially regarding to the exogenous type of the trees. If you take any of the trees, whether maybe a mangrove or mahogany, or even in the case of teak, oak, whatever if you are going to take, the classification or the layer which has been formed or the rings, it remains the same. Only thing it is, each of them has the different genus, and the rate of the growth also tends to differ. Now, in the next part of the timber, we need to see that how the timber have been utilized in a society. Do they directly cut the wood and utilize it for the construction purpose? If yes, means in what manner? Or if no, means then what are the steps or the procedures to be followed in order to see that the durability tends to increase, or the life cycle or the lifespan of the timber tends to be much more feasible in nature. As I have stated that timber, it is the structural unit of the wood, or structural part of wood. All the timber can be regarded as a wood, but all wood cannot be mentioned or stated as a timber. This is one of the important note that you need to keep it into the mind. Now, moving on to the next part, it is how the timber are manufactured. In the process of the manufacturing of the timber, there are different things to be allocated. What are those? Let us get to know one by one. We have process of manufacturing of timber. First one is related to the felling of trees. Felling of trees. After the felling, it has to be properly seasoned. It has to be properly seasoned. That we call it as seasoning of trees. Seasoning of the trees. Meanwhile, there is also other sorts of an classification in the seasoning also. What are the different types, how it is being done, how it has to be cut, and how it has to be converted, and how it should be marketed. Before marketing, you need to have the preservation. Therefore, you have conversion process, conversion, and fourth one it is conversion of trees into the formation of the timber. Finally, you need to have what are the preservation methods. Then you can go for the marketing of the timber. Now, let us move on for first one is felling of trees. Felling of trees is normally done when the tree has attained the maturity age. If the age of the tree is less than the attainment of the maturity, then it tends to start decay at a rapid rate because of the presence of the sapwood. They are not completely matured enough, and the reactivity where I have previously mentioned, the vascular conducting tissues are also present. So, therefore, in that particular cases, water has to be driven away due to the osmosis, and here the felling of the trees should also be taken care at the right time itself only. If it has been completely or over matured, then another problem takes place. Either the heartwood as well as the sapwood, they both of them are having some of the problems. What are those problems? Mainly, if you are going to see in the case of the age 50 to 100 years, some of the trees they possess 50 to 100 years, the age of the maturity. Sometimes it is, for some trees it is greater than 12 or what we call it as 15 to 30 years. There are different sorts of the classification because felling of the trees is not common, and it depends upon the type of the trees which are being grown in the plantation. Next thing it is seasoning of the trees. Next it is the seasoning of the trees. Here one point I forgot to tell, if the felling of the trees is attained after the maturity, then the heartwood begins to decay. Therefore, care has to be taken at the cutting of the trees or felling of the trees should be takes place at the right time or the age of the maturity. Next, seasoning of the trees. Seasoning means the process of subjecting the trees for the removal of the moisture content, because whatever the water content where the tree possesses during the transportation period of its life, it has been retained there even after the cutting. Therefore, after the cutting, it has to be subjected for the seasoning process. That means process of subjecting the trees either for the circulation or for the thermal air circulation, or in the case of the water or in the case of the boiling. That kind of the phenomena where to reduce the weight of the trees, we call it as a seasoning. Seasoning involves two types. The seasoning, it has two types. One we call it as a natural part of the seasoning, natural, and then artificial. What is meant by natural part of the seasoning of the trees? Trees when are being cut, as I told that earlier, The 50% of this weight, it contains the water. Therefore, it has to be removed. Otherwise, it is of no use itself only if you take it for any construction purpose, that too for the any load bearing part or maybe battens in the form or like a wooden beam itself only. No. So, therefore, it has to be seasoned enough, air or passing through the water. These are the two types, air or water. These are the two medium for the circulation, where it has been stacked. Either it is in the case of the 1/9 like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 like this, they have been stacked, or maybe in a crisscross manner. The crisscross manner, stack of the wood are being arranged. Normally they have to be kept in a horizontal manner, not in a vertical. The log of the wood which has been taken up has to be kept in a horizontal manner, especially to provide the free circulation of the air. Now, in the case of the artificial seasoning, it is done through the different process. One is through the boiling method, boiling. Second one is related to the oven drying, subjected for the large ovens, and passing of the electric current, seasoning can be done, and even by the usage of the salts, chemical salts, they are also utilized even for the artificial seasoning. Now, if you take the boiling, a large tank is being made to see that the wood or the log of the wood are being completely immersed into the water and water tends to boil. That kind of an industry are being established since from the past. Therefore, here boiling it takes 3 to 4 hours, but more amount of the labors are required for it. Hence, it is an ideal part, but instead of the boiling, steam curing can also be done, where only a small quantity of the water is required, but the temperature arises more. Therefore, it almost reduces the seasoning period or the span itself only. Therefore, in order to see that the shrinkages and all are to be maintained in a proper conditions, or warping should not take place, or decay of the wood should not take place. That is one thing. Oven drying, or where the log of the wood are being placed in a large scale type of an oven, or what we call it as a kiln. Kiln seasoning we call it as. This kiln seasoning, it is like a type of an oven. The flue gases are being passed over it, and therefore the heated air part, when it is being passed through it for a continuous period of the time, minimum at least for the period of the 6 months or like so on, then it can be utilized. Or in other senses, maybe in the period of 3 to 2 months also. Next, electric current means, obviously you know the phenomena of the Ohm's law, isn't it? V is equal to IR. Same thing here. The electric current has been passed through the wood, where wood acts as a conductor of the electricity. Therefore, resistance will be slightly lesser, obviously in the case of the wet condition. In the case of the dry condition, resistance will be more. So, therefore, in order to increase the resistance, therefore, in other sense, the electric current is being passed to dry away the moisture content which is being present in excess of the quantity to make it into an optimal position. This is the another part of the seasoning. Salts, potassium dichromate and hydrogen peroxide, that can also be utilized. These are the salts where the salt solution is being prepared and the log of the wood are immersed in it. That kind of the reaction which will take place, see that the preservation of the timber has also been happened here itself only. Therefore, in this regard of the seasoning of the trees, we have learnt what are the natural as well as artificial. Water means here, coming back to this natural part, where a fresh part of the stream is been passing on, their huge log of the woods are being placed like a barrier. so that whatever the water has been passed, it will get the saturation part. When the saturation limit has been reached, the sapping phenomena tends to reduce. Thereby, the seasoning can be attained because it has to be dried also. Next step is, next thing it is, after the proper seasoning, you need to convert the trees. How are you going to convert the trees? Do you take complete log of wood to whole house and therefore you build it like that? No, it has to be cut into whatever the regular shape as well as the sizes which is required, a proper thickness, length, width and breadth, because in engineering concerns, the geometrical dimensions plays a very important role. Based upon that part, there are marketing forms which can be utilized. In the conversion means process of cutting of the timber, the well seasoned or the dried portion of the timber in different directions. That kind we call it as a conversion of a timber. What are those? There are different sorts of conversion. Let me tell you one by one. I hope so you're also going to get the picture related to the conversion of the timber process. Now, whatever the cutting, if it is been taking place, if the cutting has been taking place tangential to the annular rings, then that kind of the cutting has a different name, which is like a secant in nature. This kind we call it as a sawing. We call it as sawing. What are those type of this sawing? Where a mill is being provided, a cutter is also being ready, it is being mechanically driven by the shaft. Finally, the cutting process takes place. Now, in this process, we call it as a ordinary or flat type of sawing. Ordinary or the flat type of the sawing, where the sawing takes place tangential to the annular rings of the wood. This part is normally adopted and which is the most economical in nature. Economical in nature, because the sawing also has some of the advantages. What are those? If you have some of the defects in the wood like a knots and all, or maybe irregular growth and all, that has to be cut and it is of no use itself only. And if the tree is having or suffering from any sorts of the diseases, though it has been felt, then care has to be taken for the proper seasoning in order to see that it has to be completely preserved in nature. So this kind of the sawing renders the economical, or we call it as a flat type of sawing. Next we have the quarter type of the sawing. Quarter type of the sawing. How does this sawing takes place is another sort of the question. The sawing takes place in a quarter manner where the medullary rays are being originated and the annular ring is also being present like this. Now, if I wanted to saw, I need to see that the sawing is being done right angles to the medullary rays like this. Right angles to the medullary rays. This kind of the sawing is what we call it as a quarter sawing. quarter sawing. Next comes another two types of the sawing. One we call it as a tangential sawing. We have a tangential sawing. Like this, if we have it has, the cutting will be done in a tangential manner, like this. The cutting process is being carried out completely at right angles to each other. This kind of the sawing phenomena is what we call it as a tangential sawing phenomena. Here in the tangential sawing phenomena, it has been done only to get the pieces in a proper range as well as in a geometrical shape and as well as sizes. Only thing, it is slightly costlier in nature, this kind of the sawing. We call it as tangential sawing. Next, another kind of the sawing is also being introduced. Another kind, what is that? If you take in the case of the quarter sawing itself only, outer bark, medullary rays which are being there present, annular rings, now if I going to cut it in an inclined position, this kind of the sawing which has been taking place in a radial direction, this is the extra portion. Now if the cutting has been taking place in a radial direction along the path of the medullary rays, then this kind of the sawing is what we call it as radial sawing. Completely it is inclined in nature. So these are the different types of the sawing which you can see in a sawmill industries. Whatever the industries which are being present in the timber yard or the layout, especially if you can see the huge number, maybe near the satellite town in Bangalore, there we have a separate layout. We call it as a timber yard layout or timber layout. There huge logs of woods are being utilized, they are being stored, and later on when they have been properly seasoned, they are subjected for the cutting by the required portion of the sizes. This is what we call it as ordinary quarter sawing, tangential as well as radial type of the sawing process. Next, conversion is over. Okay, now how to preserve it? Preservation becomes an important part. Now in the case of the preservation, there are different methods. Either you can use a different chemicals, chemically active salts. That is the one method, because rate of the reaction or the biological degradation or not chemical degradation, mainly the timber which is being manufactured or converted into the processing forms, that has to be saved from the termite attack and even fungal attack or maybe any of the microbial attack also. Because what happens, whenever the moisture content has been more, the nutrients which are being present in the tree, they serve as a media for the growth of the organisms, especially molds and fungi. Therefore, they damage it. and that shall not tend to take place. If the damaged portion is being present, then that kind of the wood is not utilized. Even though if it is being utilized, the durability of the lifespan will be less. Keep it in the mind. Therefore, in this part, the preservation has different strategies. What are those? Application of the coal tar. The hot tar can also be applied, but it turns out to be much more darker in nature. That is the one thing. Next, we have a coal char. Coal char means about the 15 centimeter or 15, sorry, not like 15 centimeter, 15 mm of thickness, say roughly around 1.5 centimeter. The portion or the log of the wood is completely burnt out, okay, up till a range of 15 mm or 1.5 centimeter. This tends to render much more blackish in appearances. Therefore, it is said to be safer in nature. That kind of the preservation is also being done. Another aspect is, kindly remember, in the case of the stones, we have same thing, coal tar or maybe the char, maybe we have another salt solutions and all, and then finally we have also used the paint. Obviously here also the paint application comes, oil paints are used especially in that for the preservation, which is also giving the aesthetic in appearances. You might have seen for any recreational purpose or maybe for any hotels or lawns or for any restaurants or for the parks and all, they have painted the wood and all. Okay, they will carve out some of the architectural beauties in the wood. It is an artwork, and finally they go for giving the outer touching portion through the paints or the oil paints. Hence, it is being utilized there. Other than this, we also have the creosote oil. Creosote oil is a byproduct of the distillation, fractional distillation process. Even that can also be applied in order to see that the termite attack or maybe even the case of the fungal growth shall be hampered in nature. That shall not take place. That is a much more care, because termites and all, if it is tend to attack, therefore they degrade the whole quality of the wood, and the cost is also another concern. How much ever the cost that you have paid for bringing out the wood, and therefore it is being damaged by the microorganisms, means it is a loss, economic loss. Therefore, in all these things you need to consider the preservation practices or even the techniques also. Now, what are the different steps you have understand? There is a manufacturing of the timber, from starting from the felling of the trees, seasoning of the trees, and then conversion into the timber, preservation, and then finally marketing forms. Marketing forms, you have different types. But before going to the marketing forms, I would like to mention some of the usages of the timber. The preserved timber should be an ideal in nature. It should not tend to cause any certain reactions for the wood, and these kind of the preserved material or the wood has to be marketed. How it can be utilized, as I told, either for the furniture purpose, either for the load bearing purpose or non-load bearing purpose also. Even it is also utilized in the manufacturing of some of the musical instruments and wooden wagons, what we going to call it as, okay. In that particular cases, the building of the railway compartments, in olden days, wooden sleepers made out of the teak wood were utilized in order to see that shock absorbing will be more in that cases. And even in the case of the marine, where the ships or maybe the boat which were built by usage of the timber, because it has a corrosive resistant property, except apart from the termite or any other things and all, when it is being utilized, steel as well as any of the metal, they tend to corrode easily because of the presence of the salt content in the sea. Therefore, in that particular usages, now it has come across for the different sorts of the metallic combination, where you can utilize even the alloys which are much more anti-resistant, or we call it as anti-corrosion resistant. But in earlier days, still now also, even for the smaller cases, wood has been utilized, or what we call it as a timber is being utilized even for that particular purpose. One thing to mention clearly, no branch of engineering is present without the usage of the timber. If you take any of the things, maybe in electrical if you want, pole is to be utilized, even in the case of the railways, or maybe for the roadways also, maybe for the form work, even the timber is also used. And even for the scaffolding and also, yes, there also it is being utilized. Likewise, you have n number of the usages. Only thing is how, where and what to utilize and why to utilize. That particular purpose you need to think across, because this part of an application will be there in the module number 4 as well as in module number 3 also. Okay. Now, after going through all these things, what are the marketing forms of the timber? The marketing forms of the timber, there are different things. We have a pole where a log of wood having the diameter is equal to 20 centimeter can be utilized. That is a one form. The another form which we come across, it is related to the battens. We also have the plank. Plank means having the thickness which has been less than 5 mm, where the width will be greater than 50 mm. Next, fourth one is board. If you see the board means, obviously it will be more than 150 mm, therefore thickness will be less than 5 mm. Same case here also. For board, the marketing part, it is thickness has been less than 5 mm and the width which tends to exceeds more than 150 mm. That is what we call it as a board. Still there are different sorts, 5 centimeter thickness, equivalent in nature, that we call it as a batten, length and breadth, which we call it as even a 50 mm. 50 mm, all the thickness as well as the breadth totally, the square nature in it. And scantling means breadth and thickness same equal to the 50 mm. We call it as a scantling. Finally, quartering means rough part of the pieces which I have mentioned, the quarter part of the sawing, they are also being utilized. So, they are being from quartering from 50 to 150 mm. 50 to 150 mm. So, therefore, I have explained completely related to starting from the manufacturing process, felling of the tree, seasoning, conversion, preservation and marketing forms of the timber. Hope so you people have understood the concept related to the process which is being carried out and how the timbers are utilized for various sorts of the purpose, what are the precautionary measures to be taken and done. In the next part of the class, I am going to continue with another new set of the topic. Till then, please do remember all the concepts and stay tuned for it, and let us meet in the next part of the class. Thank you one and all.